Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
You're listening to the Gospel Addict Podcast, where we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel, and we interview people whose lives have been changed by the gospel. On today's episode, it's my privilege to interview Marshall Brandon, the subject of a new book titled Someplace to Be a Somebody. The book takes the reader on a journey of God's grace and the transformation of Marshall Brandon from a modern-day Saul to an incredible example of the Apostle Paul. Marshall has been set free from childhood abuse, drugs, imprisonment, rage, hatred when he allows Jesus into his life. This is just an amazing story. Welcome to the show, Marshall.
Hey, so glad to be here, Greg. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, you're welcome. If you don't mind, just take a few minutes and introduce yourself to our audience who might be asking, who is Marshall Brandon?
Well, Marshall Brandon. Oh, wow, that's a deep question because Marshall Brandon, who I know I am now is I'm a child of the King. Marshall Brandon is a man who lives in Akron, Ohio, who pastors currently at a church called Grace Baptist in Kent, Ohio. I am a husband, father of 4 children, 14 grandchildren, 5 great-grandchildren, loving life, loving this season of life, loving my God more every day. That's a brief bio of Marshall Brandon.
That's great. Why was it important for you to have your story told?
Well, I wanted to share, I like to say this, Greg, just as a correction. What it's called is God's story in Marshall Brandon's life. And because I realized that really the story isn't about me, but it's about our great God. It's a God who created me in my mother's womb and has a plan for my entire life, who has plans for me for good and not for evil. So coming to that understanding of who God is, I understand that every character in the Bible really is about his story and not our own personal stories. And so knowing that what he has allowed me to experience in life is for his glory. So I want to tell about his story in my life so that others might see and experience this great God that I've had the privilege of meeting and knowing, who lives in me now. And I want to share that good news that God is able, no matter what you're going through, what you might be experiencing. But we have a God who keeps his promises, who said, I will cause it to work together for good, no matter what you go through. It may not be good. It may not feel good. It may not look good, but our God has promised, I will, when you belong to me, I will cause that to work together good for my glory.
I love that. I love that. Well, we don't have time in this podcast to cover everything that is in the book, and it's written really well. It makes you just feel like your life is in 3D, and boy, you have experienced a lot in your life. And so, but let's just kind of walk through your life a little bit. So tell us what it was like, your childhood. Describe your childhood to our audience.
I had a very unhappy childhood. My father was an alcoholic. My mom was a rageaholic. I'm one of 6 children. I am next to the youngest one. So it was a lot of dysfunction in my family. And I was trying to figure all that out. Obviously, as a child, you're learning, and what are you learning, and what does your environment give to you to learn from and take from? Unfortunately, much of mine was very negative. There were some good spots in there, and now in hindsight, especially as a born again believer now, I can look back and see God in all of it, but it was difficult sometimes not feeling loved. Does anybody love me? And not knowing who you are. Um, am I significant? Do I have value? Do I have worth? So I was trying to figure all that out as I was experiencing abuse of beatings and physical abuse and certainly verbal abuse and just seeing all of that was, shaping me and making me a very angry young man, a very much an introvert at the time. But at the same time, that anger made me a very dangerous man, and that's what I began to develop into as in my journey as a man, young man in particular.
Now, one of the chapters in your book is called "The Wrath of Ruthie," and Ruthie is your mom, right?
Yes, yes.
And there's several stories in there, but maybe can you think of just one that you would share that just talked about that what it was like for you as a child, that when you experienced her wrath.
Yeah, my mother was I like to say was someone when she spoke, because of her intimidation, because of her rage and the beatings you experienced from Ruthie, you knew she was no one to play with. So in some ways, she was keeping some kind of order in our family because, again, I had older brothers, 5 boys and 1 girl, with the father was pretty much absent because of his alcoholism. So Ruthie was the enforcer, and she would beat you in ways that where her rage came out that was almost incomprehensible. I would look at myself sometimes after a beating. She would beat us with a thing called an extension. Well, it's an extension cord. She'd fold that extension cord, double it up, and just beat you with that thing. You'd have welt marks, and she'd hit you anywhere she could hit you, across your face and the back, and you'd be bleeding sometimes. And experiencing that, I was going, man, that's my mother. Does anybody love me? But on the other side, the flip side of that, when she wasn't raging, she had a side to her that was extremely caring and loving. And so this dysfunction, this sin in her life, was was very difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Well, and early on, you started to experience, I know one of the themes that kind of runs throughout your this book is just how you handle racism and how you've encountered it from a young as a young child, as a young man, as a young adult. Is there anything you want to share about that? Like, I know one of the chapters is called "Visiting the Roots of Racism." Any memories stand out to you in how that first kind of showed up in your life?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, just as I think about some of that, just a little history. My grandfather was actually a slave name is Joe Bryan. He was born in 1859. That's my grandfather. So my father was next, I'm 2 generations, how you look at that, away from slavery. So a lot of that carryover from that was very present in our family. So when we moved from Alabama, with the great part of the Great Migration, I know that it was now, but to Youngstown, Ohio, to a steel mill. My father was a sharecropper, which isn't much more than an indentured servant, if you will. Didn't make much money, was uneducated. Went, I think, maybe to the 6th grade. It was a very difficult life for him. But anyhow, he moved us to Youngstown, Ohio, and so a lot of our family was still, especially his siblings, my my grandparents were still alive, or at least on her side, both were still alive, just his mama. So I say that to say we would take frequent trips from Ohio down into Alabama. Every summer we went, probably up until I was age 13 or 14. Every summer we'd go stay, maybe a month. and visit with the relative. Well, along the way, this is in the 50s, so America was where it was at that particular time, and a very segregated country, racist country, full of bigotry and those kind of things. And so you try to navigate that as a minority, as a black man, young black man, and just seeing the differences when we would ride from Youngstown to Cincinnati, kind of what they considered the Mason-Dixie line. And that's where you would enter into the South. So we would get off a Greyhound bus, and back then they had a bus line called Trailways, which went further into the South. And you begin to see the difference, and we'd have to get off the front of the bus and go to the back of the bus. And when they stopped at bus station, everything was separate, it was segregated. Colored bathrooms, colored water fountains, no place to eat. We couldn't eat in the bus station, so my mother would have to pack a lunch for us so we could eat. So seeing those kind of things begin to obviously give you some perspective on maybe where we were living in at that particular time. And going further in the South, getting instructions from my mom, what I could do, what I couldn't say, stores I could go in and couldn't go in, just to protect me from, crossing a line perhaps that could be deadly at the worst. And so we did that, and so I'm seeing this, and I'm seeing the difference, if you will, from the South to the North, where I was starting to go to school and do some of those kind of things. And the impact of that made me, again, it furthered my anger, just because as Black people, many times in America, just because of our history of slavery, we weren't even considered human. We just wanted somebody to say, man, I have worth. You knew that within yourself. But for somebody to look at you and just disregard your significance as a human being was very hard, very difficult. And so you wanted to push back on that and go, I have value. I am somebody. But who am I? And that search for significance. Who am I? Did we do anything? History was changed and not written by us. And we were written out of history. And I'm sitting in school at times going, did we do anything? Did Black people, by we, did Black people do anything, that mattered? Only couple I remember when I was going through school was George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. That was it. Columbus discovered America. We didn't do anything. So I felt, man, we didn't have very much worth to yourself. We didn't do anything. And then things began to change when I was joining the service. At least I began to get a different perspective on America. It was the 60s then at that time, and things were beginning to change in our country in terms of marching. Dr. King started in the 50s, but doing these civil rights marches, the civil rights era. And so marching and Black people saying, hey, we are somebody, and James Brown singing songs, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. Begin to take pride in ourselves. Hey, my hair is good. My kinky hair is beautiful. It's not, I don't need to be anybody else. It's who God has made me. So we begin to move into some of those things and getting them a Black pride, so to speak. And I can remember just my political awareness changing as a result of that, and beginning to read about Black people who had accomplished some great things, but were written out of the history books as we knew them. And so all of that was part of the journey of growing into and dealing with racism and bigotry and hatred just because of the color of your skin. And so those are some of the things that I was dealing with.
Yeah. So you had a kind of a rough home that you were being raised in. I have no doubt that your parents loved you, but they just, but sometimes it's in light of some of the things you just mentioned, the history, there's a reason why people act the way they do, but tell us more about like what you were like as a teenager, like, because I know that, we're building up to the real life-changing event that happened in your life, which is when God really got a hold of your life. And but what was going on as a teenager as you were trying to find that significance, yeah, to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Yeah, because of all this background, these beatings and bullying by my bigger, older brothers and all of that, I had to learn to fight. I had to learn to be a survivor. How am I going to get through this? How am I? So this anger was intrinsic. I had become so angry inside, and it taught me how to fight. And I learned how to fight, Greg. I could fight. That's one thing I could do. So in in a blue collar town, a lot of times you got your significance in the streets by how good could you fight. That guy can fight, and so people respected you because of that aspect of your life. So I started fighting and was very good at fighting and very angry. That's what came out. That helped. That fueled my desire to fight. And when I fought someone, and so as a result of that, I got a lot of street cred. So as a teenager, I began to do that. And probably by the time I was 13, I was leading. I had a gang. I got involved in a gang and became the leader of that gang, a gang called A New Breed. And as a result of that, we did a lot of things, fighting and territorial things and all those kind of things. But I knew somewhere, Greg, inside of me, that it was more to life than that. This got to be. I'm searching for things. Where do I find it with my fists? I didn't know my parents were uneducated. Like you said, they didn't know what they didn't know. They knew what they knew. They didn't know any different. So no direction. Hey, finish school. Start. It was no course of action. Take the next step. Maybe you'll go to college. Here's hope. There's, if you pursue this track, so to speak, you can change your life. So I didn't have any of that. I'm going to be doomed to Youngstown, Ohio, steel mills of Ohio, the repetition. And in my heart, I wanted more. I knew somewhere there was more to life than this. And how do I find that? So as a teenager, again, very angry, going into my adulthood, still maintaining that anger toward others, and in particular toward white folks.
Mm. Yeah, I want to get to that. You and I know each other, but I know you on as a brother in Christ. I didn't know what you were like before then, and it's really hard for me to imagine what you were like, what your life was like, and that, like, that anger you talked about, and that hatred you had at one point towards white people, and so I want to talk to that. So then you end up in Vietnam, and the book makes it sound like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like you wanted to go to Vietnam.
That's true. Yeah, I was not drafted. So my childhood, some of the people I looked at for heroes, because I'm always looking, well, who are the heroes? And so there wasn't a lot of black ones, right? So some of the white ones became people like Audie Murphy. They were Army. We played Army and Cowboys and Indians. Those are the kind of games we played when I was a kid. Okay, so man, I wanted to fight. I wanted to be. I could fight physically, but then I wanted to fight as a soldier. I wanted to be. Much as I knew about my country, as bad as it was, I wanted to represent my country. I wanted to be a soldier. And all that meant. So therein, I joined the Army, and I joined at 17. My parents gave me permission because I wasn't old enough to go until you were 18 on your own. So they signed papers, agreed, so I could go at 17. But as soon as I turned 18, by the time I turned 18, 55 days after I turned 18, I got orders to go to Vietnam and did the training. The military was good for me. It showed me discipline. It showed me respect for authorities. It began to teach me some things that I really enjoyed learning, even though it was hard to learn. I appreciated it. Let me put it that way. It began to give me some direction. And so here I am at 18, so young. I thought I was old. When you're 18, sometimes you think you know a lot, but you realize you don't know. After a while, you know very little. But anyhow, I go to Vietnam, and so this war has a way of maturing you in many ways. Your eyes are open. I'm stepping into the middle of a jungle, 1966. The smells are overwhelming. Bombs are going off around you. It is like, what have I got myself into? There, though, doing that tour, I've seen a lot of horrific things. And one of the things that, again, this is the 60s, so things are changing. They're marching and all of that's going on in our country. So at the same time, there some people are hating Vietnam War and protesting against it. So there's a lot of tension going on in our country. And as a result of that, though, I begin to read and see propaganda from a propagandist named Anoa Hanna. She would drop leaflets that would say things like, "Go home, black man, your war is in America," you know. And so it made you think, like, that's right. There are places I can go home and not go into. That still segregation was still very prevalent. So that fueled my anger even more. And as a result of that, I got angrier and began to say, I know power is never conceded, so we're going to have to take it. So I began to prepare myself to go to war and to kill some folks when I came back home.
Wow. I remember reading in the book about your experience when you got on that plane, that long plane ride overseas, and how everyone's bags are piled in the, like, you can see them piled up in the plane, and it was so loud you could hardly talk to the person next to you, and you were looking around to see if there were any other Black people on the plane with you, and I imagine you were one of the few. Is that correct? Or
that's correct. Yeah, it wasn't very many of us. In fact, I'm trying to remember now. Maybe 3 or 4 at the time on my particular. People went over as units, but I was, my unit went over ahead of me, so I went over pretty much as an independent and got assigned to a unit once I was there. But yeah, it was. We were a minority for sure, and I was one of them.
So what happens after you get back from Vietnam? What did you do? What was your frame of mind? You kind of mentioned it just right there, but what happened in your life then?
I'm preparing for war. So I began to do everything I could. I began to gather weapons, dynamite, grenades, stealing it, hiding it, preparing to go to war. So I have this stockpile but when I come back and begin to try to organize some people to fight with me, they weren't in the same place, thank God, politically, or in the same mindset. And they was going, this brother's been to Vietnam, and he's a little cray. He's crazy. He's come back. He's crazy talking the way he's talking. And probably was. I probably was at that point. I didn't see myself with that, but I'm glad that people were able to recognize that. So anyhow, something what dramatically changed all that, was I started to use heroin. Heroin is a drug that for when you're high on it, all your problems go away. It's a false peace that represents something that only God can give you. But for that moment, as an unbeliever, it gave me peace for 10 hours, 8 hours, and then back to it again. So this addiction, I got addicted, and it changed my whole life. It became Lord of my life, not revolution, not killing folks. It was like, I'm chasing this drug. I was an addict, and then it was on the throne of my life. It drove everything I did from sun up to sundown. As a result of that, using that, I couldn't maintain a job. I had a job. I couldn't stay at work. So I began to steal and do those kind of things and rob, and ended up getting caught and sent to prison in 1970. I was sent to the Mansfield Reformatory. That's the place that, if you ever saw the movie Shawshank Redemption, that's where that movie was filmed. So here I am now, Vietnam veteran, young man, finding myself, everything I wanted to avoid, I find myself walking through a prison, and in prison for 10 to 25 years. I'm sentenced to, saying, oh my God, what am I going to do here? How am I going to do this? How will I make it?
Wow. 10 to 25 years was your sentence?
That was my sentence.
Who? Obviously I don't think you were in there that long, were you?
I did. I wasn't. They had, Mansfield was for what they called rehabilitation. So you could go before a parole board, and they could let you, or give you early release if you were behaved yourself as an honor inmate, did what you were supposed to do. And so that became my challenge while in prison. I said, I want to do everything in here I can do to be released when I get a chance to go to the parole board to ask them if they would consider releasing me. So I joined every club and said, how can I make myself better in here? I finished school. I started college. I got a trade. I got in every organization that I could get in. I got in AA, NA, CA. I even joined AAA. I thought that was for people that had a real bad problem. But so I got in every one of those. I became an honor inmate in there and ended up with an early release. One of the first guys in the state of Ohio to be released on a program in 1973 called the furlough program. And that's when I came to Akron, Ohio, to a place called the Denton House. That was a Christian organization. I wasn't a Christian, wasn't caring anything about Christianity, but God had a plan. That's where we begin to see God working in the plan. And he put me in this halfway house, and a man there began to witness to me. And much as what he said, it was his life. I saw the peace that this man had in his life, and it impacted me. I never forgot. His name is Dave Fair, and Dave said, he asked me that question, Marshall, do you know Jesus? And I had to say, no, I don't know. But it was a seed that stuck with me. And I want to just encourage listeners today, if you're sharing your faith, don't wait on it. Wait on God to do it. He's the only one who can, but don't be discouraged if you don't see results right. 3 years later, it was 3 years later, I never forgot Dave. I never forgot that seed. And God used a number of different circumstances to bring me to himself. But 3 years later, I gave my heart to Jesus Christ.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm friends with the Fair family. They're great, great people. And that's a great thought there about witnessing, is that, you know, we scatter seed, and you just never know when it's going to start to take root and bear fruit. And I think I know what happened. I think this is this the time when your wife came along?
Yeah. Now I come out on this furlough program, and I start to go to college. I'm going to Akron University. And so I'm up at Akron University, and that's when I saw my beautiful bride walking on the campus. And I began to stalk. I began to show up where classes were after I was introduced, and through a number of different circumstances, she gave me a date, and we began to date, and we fell in love. This was 1973. 1974, we got married. Asked for a hand in marriage a number of different times. She finally said yes. And but I had a double life because I had started back to using drugs again secretly. And so here I am, an addict again, but I'm living in both worlds. And that's what addicts do. Sometimes they live in both worlds. The secret world is low down, it's dirty, it's dark. And then the other side, where people are unaware of your addiction, you're trying to live this out. So that began to happen with my beautiful wife. And
she called you out. She called you out several times. She saw that other side of you, and it sounds like it was rough on your marriage. Like you had a rough early marriage.
Oh, it was very rough. It was because I really didn't know I still didn't know who I was. You know, I'm a lost man. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how to do life. I didn't have role models per se that were in my life, and so I don't know how to do life. So I'm doing what like my parents. I'm perpetuating some dysfunctional things, some unhealthy things, and that's because that's all I knew. And so my marriage was very hard. My wife, I think we were married for 2 years, and she had seen enough. She says, you know, I can't see you kill you. I love you too much. I remember her telling me that, watch you destroy yourself. I won't be a part of that. So I'm going to leave. And I kept hearing her say, I'm going to leave. And I came home one day, and that's exactly what she asked me to leave. I said, I'm not going anywhere. And so she went out and said, all right, then I have to do the next thing. And packed up and left me, which was a turning point. One of the best things she ever did was to leave me. Because if she'd have allowed me to stay there, I would have abused her. I would have used her. And so the best thing she did was to be healthy was say, let me get out of this. I need to step out of this. And that gave me an awakening, like, oh man, this person that I had that was significant in my life, now I have nobody but street folks. And street folks care nothing about you. I mean, it's low down and dirty in the street. Don't anybody tell you any different. And every man for himself and God for us all. But it's so I got to experience that without any accountability. So I did everything I was big enough and bad enough to do. And it brought me to an end. It brought me to the end of myself. I found that there was no happiness in those things. Everything I thought would bring me happiness ended up, it didn't. It did temporarily. Now, don't get me wrong. The world has something to offer, but it's only temporal. And then you have to go back and get some more. And so that's what I began to discover. And one night I was on my knees crying out. I said, God, I don't know who you are. I've heard a lot of people try to recruit me, Muslims and Buddhists. And I said, I don't know if you're up there. All right, who are you? Will you make yourself real to me? Please show me who you are. And he did. Ultimately, as we go on with the story, he made himself real to me and showed me who he was in the person of Jesus Christ.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.